first of all, their pressure on the national media has an effect. I mean, look, even in totalitarian states, they respond to pressure, certainly in more democratic societies. So there are pressures on the media have an effect. Furthermore, the media are in many ways more open and free than they were 40 years ago because they reflect the general raising of the level of civilization. I mean, a lot of people in the media are people who came through the experiences of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they're just different than they were 40 years ago. So you don't get the kind of, unquestioning loyalty. I mean, if an American president today tried to do what Kennedy did in 1962, there'd be an uproar in the media, not just in the public. And besides, there's now alternatives, like one of the earlier questioners mentioned, that the internet is a major alternative. New technology wasn't involved for that purpose, but it's there, is giving all sorts of options for alternative ways of communicating. For one thing, printing is just a lot cheaper than it ever was. Desktop publishing is now very feasible. You don't have to have a big printing establishment. The electronic communications there are all kinds of ways. And organizations that develop, they develop their own intercommunication and interaction and media, and that's the way things happen. So there's plenty of opportunities. I mean, the period when the press was most free was about the mid-19th century. I mean, at that time, just keeping to say England and the United States, the two cases that have been studied, I imagine it's the same elsewhere. In the mid-19th century, there was a very lively, popular press, very widely read by working people, by everyone. But, much reached far beyond the commercial media at the time. It was very diverse. It represented, reflected public interests and public concerns, and was very popular. In Britain, they tried to close it down by censorship of various kinds, but that didn't work. There were too many ways to avoid it. And it was finally understood that the way to eliminate it was by advertising, by reliance on advertising and by concentration of capital. So just through the effect of reliance on advertising, which was then just a kind of beginning, like around a century ago, and concentration of capital, they realized that over time they could marginalize the independent popular press, which couldn't get the advertising, of course, because advertisers don't like what they were saying, and didn't have the capital. And it took a long time. So in England, it was actually up until about 40 years ago, still the case 40 years ago, that the main newspaper in England, the Daily Herald, was a kind of labor-oriented, social democratic newspaper, very popular. Everybody had outsold all the others. The Mirror, which was the main tabloid, was the same, kind of leftist paper, popular paper. But they kind of succumbed to advertising pressure and capital control. The United States happened a bit earlier, but it was the same process. Advertising is, it's part of a much bigger industry. Advertising is part of the public relations industry, which is a huge industry. And it developed very consciously around the First World War in the two most democratic countries, England and the United States. And there's a good reason for it. They were coming to as the countries were becoming more free, that just through popular struggle, and people were winning the franchise, and you couldn't shut them up anymore by force, it was understood that you're going to have to control people by controlling opinion and attitudes, because we can't rely on force anymore. And control of opinion and attitudes means, there was actually a phrase for it. This was the time when what was called scientific management of work was becoming a big issue, Taylorite management, Ford and all that stuff. But it was also understood you want to not only control very closely the lives of people in their work time, but also you have to control them in their off-work time. And what you have to do is turn them into passive, obedient consumers who don't pay, don't try to get out of our hair, basically. Pay attention to what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. You get them trapped into consumerism, isolated from one another, atomized, control their beliefs. That's where notions like manufacture of consent come from right after this First World War. And out of this came huge industries. And advertising is a large part of it, but and it of course affects the media enormously. I mean, if any of you are, if you watch television, for example, take say television. When you turn on the television set, the corporation doesn't make any money, right? Like you don't pay them when you turn it on unless it's cable. But they do. So why do they do it? Well, they do it because of the advertising. So the resources and the creativity and the effort and so on in the whole television industry goes into advertising. In fact, within the